Welcome to the PA Books podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. While the focus is always on Pennsylvania, topics like the Revolutionary War, the Battle of Gettysburg, the Industrial Revolution, the coal and steel industries, and authors like John Updike, David McCullough, and John Grogan have a universal appeal. We hope you enjoy this podcast.
This week on PA Books, Sharon McConnell-Sidorick, author of Silk, Stockings, and Socialism.
Sharon McConnell-Sidorick, author of Silk, Stockings, and Socialism, Philadelphia's radical hosiery workers from the Jazz Age to the New Deal. How'd you get interested in this?
Well, I sort of fell into it kind of serendipitously. I met two people, Howard and Alice Kreckman. They were in their 80s at the time, I guess. And I came to know them, and through that I found out that they had been lifelong social justice activists. They had marched for civil rights. They had marched against the Vietnam War. They had marched for women's rights. And I was very curious. At the time, they were living in Willingboro, New Jersey, and I was very curious about what created people like this. And I started talking to them, and they, over a period of time, when I got to know them, they told me that now they had actually grown up in, as they said, a section of Philadelphia called Kensington. And I thought, well, I grew up in the greater Kensington area. And so when I told them that, they started telling me all these stories about, both of them had gone to work in a hosiery mill when they were 14 years old, and they left school. And they started telling me about the fight for unionization. It went through the period of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and some of the things that happened in the neighborhood, some of the strikes, some of the martyrs, some of the real activity of women, a lot of women. And I was just really amazed by it because, as I said, I grew up in the greater Kensington area. I came from a union family. I grew up working class, and I knew nothing about this history at all. It had just been lost. And so, and I was talking to them, I said, well, how did this get, I just can't believe that this hasn't been known to people like me. And they just looked at me, and Howard just said, well, I guess you have to write it then. So that was really the thing, and they've kind of been sitting on my shoulders ever since.
Well, how big an industry was the hosiery industry? I mean, it sounds like it's a fairly narrow product line.
It is a narrow product line, but in the 1920s, the book is basically about the 1920s Jazz Age and the Great Depression, New Deal era of the 1930s. And in that period, the 1920s in particular, these are full-fashioned hosiery, which I'll explain what they are, was the most important industry in the city in the late 20s. It's part of the textile industry. Textile was always a major industry in Philadelphia. But in that period, because of the flapper, essentially, the 20s, when there was major changes in society of all the consumer products and all that came out. And with the two major constitutional amendments, the 18th Amendment of Prohibition and the 19th Amendment of women's suffrage, giving women the vote, it really changed a lot of gender relations. We don't always realize that, but when you look on the ground, you really see it. Women all of a sudden were being portrayed as being equal throughout the popular press and everything. And there's all these things of heroic women based on the way that the suffragettes stuck out being put in prison and force-fed and And all this comes out in the 20s. And so women are determined at that point, it just changes the whole dynamics. And they are getting rid of the old clothing that's so constrictive, and the corsets and undergarments, and also the dresses get a lot shorter and they're looser, they're more comfortable. And at that time when that happens, you can suddenly see women's legs. They cared about what kind of hosiery they were wearing. Previously, hosiery was knitted for the most part. I mean, there was full fashion around, but it was a luxury product before the 20s.
What does that mean, full fashion?
Full fashioned is, well, the most popular hosiery, the earlier hosiery, is knitted on a circular, and it's kind of like a straight tube, so that, and when you wore it, after a while it would bag and sag, and when you had long dresses, nobody cared. But full fashioned, I guess it was actually the full fashion machines around 1860. The industry comes to the United States around in the 1880s, but it's a small luxury product because it's very skilled workers. They have these large machines with about 10,000 needles on them that have to be kept in perfect alignment, and they use fine silk fibers. So it's actually knitted flat, and the knitters, they have to add stitches and drop stitches so that it comes off the machine when it's joined together with this seam up the back, this sexy seam up the back. It's already in the shape of a leg. So it's thin, it enhances the legs, and it doesn't sag or anything. And with the era of the 20s, with the short dresses, it just takes off all over the place. And everyone and his brother is trying to jump into the hosiery industry. And there's a real boom. And Philadelphia has been a center of textile production, so it was really the largest center for full-fashioned hosiery, although, like I said, it took off all over.
How big was it? I mean, how many people did it employ? You said it was the dominant manufacturer in the city at the time?
It was the largest in that because textile, a lot of it's moving south to various different times. But at that time, it was certainly the most profitable, and a lot of manufacturers that had done other things were jumping into it, and even big stores were starting to manufacture it, and you even get foreign capital coming in. So it was so important that the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania did major studies on it in the 20s and 30s, and that was very helpful for me because even that interviews of people that I was able to find. So the number of people employed varied a lot. At the early part, it was, before it took off, it was certainly a small industry. But then when it takes up there and it's spreading and all these shops are coming, they're bringing in all these new workers, and they're very young. And a lot of them at this period, they really are jazz babies. They're getting into the whole jazz age culture of illegal alcohol and dances and black bottom dances, and they cut their hair short, and they're wearing these short dresses, and they're partying a lot, but then they're brought into this industry. So that in and of itself created a challenge for the union. The union was actually established back in 1909 and in Kensington. So Kensington, over many, many years, has been a place where a lot of immigrants came because there was so many jobs here. That was the industrial section of the city. And so they're actually, the union itself was actually a direct descendant of the Knights of Labor, which was also founded in Kensington in the 1860s. Was the workforce mostly immigrants? No, actually not in this period, because we had immigration restriction. But the young people, the majority of them were born here, but a lot of them had foreign-born parents. So, and people tend to think of Kensington as Irish or whatever, and certainly there were a lot of Irish, but over this whole period, you also get, and you can see it from the names, you're getting Polish, and you're getting Eastern European, and you're getting Italian, and as well as Irish and English. It was originally an industry, came from England, but that was back a ways.
What was life like for a mill worker at the time?
Well, the mill workers were, with the hosiery industry, it was kind of what you call some people call like the aristocracy of it, because they were well paid, because it was.
Oh, they were well paid?
They were initially, because it was a very skilled industry, and it was in such high demand, you didn't have a lot of people trained in it. They had a 4-year apprenticeship system. And even a lot of the other jobs that were held by women, there was a lot of women that did the seaming and the various other jobs. They had even apprenticeship systems for them. It was like from 6 months to a year. So you couldn't just bring somebody off the street right away. And so in union shops in particular, in 1922, the union won a major strike in the city and had control of the industry. So in union shops in particular, they had good conditions and wages were higher. But as the expansion takes off, you get all these people coming and opening non-union shops, and they're working 60-hour weeks, some of them, and sometimes the lighting is bad, and they're using these very small fibers, so you tended to end up wearing glasses pretty quickly, and so that was part of the problem too. Was this whole expansion, and you start getting overproduction because and if you know anything about the 20s, it end up with the crash in 29. A lot of that had to do with overproduction and underconsumption. That's exactly what's happening in the hosiery industry.
What was the male-female breakdown among the employees?
Initially, it was more men to women, but they sort of hit parity by the end of the 20s.
Was this unusual at the time in industries in general?
I think it depends on the industry. Certainly in the garment industry, you had a lot of female employees. But in textile, it probably was more unusual.
Did they do similar jobs? I mean, were there male jobs and female jobs?
There were male jobs and female jobs. All the knitters, which were the highest paid and most skilled, were male, and the knitters' helpers were male. This will eventually change, but the women's jobs, and a lot of this is traditional. They did things that they felt that women had more nimble fingers or something that they could do. So they had called topping, because the stocking itself was actually knitted in 2 pieces, a foot and the leg, and then they had to be joined together at the end there. So women did the topping, where they would take from the footer to the legger and join that together, and then they did what they called looping on some kind of machines, where they would close the foot with some kind of flat seam, and then the seaming that, putting it together for the finished product.
Was this like a reasonable length work day and a reasonable length work week, or was it kind of sweatshops?
No, not initially. It wasn't. Like I said, they might work in some of the shops 60 hours a week. And the union, that was one of the big things, was keeping down the going after hours and conditions, as well as maintaining wages. So in union shops, they got it down to I think it was 48 and a half hours a week.
Your book's subtitle is Philadelphia's Radical Hosiery Workers. So what was radical about the hosiery workers? What made them radical?
Well, they were socialist-led. That's part of this, what it's about. And they had this vision that people had to be treated fairly, that they had to be paid fairly, and they also had this idea that working people should not be a push-down class. So they had put out, a lot of their literature and everything is putting out a lot of defiance, of things where, have to call the boss Mister, or that you have to be ask for everything you do, do that. These are your rights. They did have a work ethic. They believed that people should work, but they believed that work had to be available and fair. And they were constantly trying to put this out to the young people. In the past, with the older knitters, they had, through various things, they had established this strong union, which is how but with all the new people coming in and young people and jazz babies at that, they really had to try to figure out some way to relate to them and to give this vision again, because they had a broader vision than just the workplace. They were also very connected with the community and of building what I call working class cosmopolitanism, which is something that they felt that all working people had to be united and they had rights, all of them.
Who were the they behind this? I mean, who decided that it should be a union driven by socialism as opposed to just...
Well, there were other groups in there too. It just evolved that way. There, like I said, it was founded in 1909 originally. 1913 it becomes a national union.
And what was the name of it?
At that time, it was the American Federation of Full-Fashioned Hosiery Workers, which is a mouthful. But and the people that there were Wobblies, certainly in some areas. I don't know if you know anything about them.
Well, explain to people who don't know.
Wobblies were more syndicalists, I guess. They didn't believe in a lot of like union structure or something. It was more of a move upwards. And there were socialists. Kensington and Philadelphia actually has a long history of socialism, which a lot of people don't know about. But so there were socialists, a lot of the German socialists that came over in the earlier period that, there were German socialist singing societies and lots of meetings. And so there were a number of German socialists involved in this. Later on, there's a few communists, but they never really become big in leadership.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. You say in 1922, Branch 1 submitted for referendum vote a proposal authorizing a contribution of $1,000 to the Friends of Soviet Russia to be used for relief work, as well as a call demanding recognition of the Soviet Union and the establishment of trade relations. Was there an international element to it?
Yes, absolutely. Well, the socialists were international, for one thing. And you see this later on. You see a lot of internationalism of back and forth across the Atlantic in particular, which really was going on for a long time, because when people come over, they don't just automatically lose their connections with where they come from. But yes, there was definitely internationalism, and I think in that period, certainly the Soviet Revolution in 1917 had an effect on a lot of people on the left, that they were seeing it as a beginning for world socialism. So there were connections with the Socialist Party in Germany and England and France, and and you see that later on with housing too. When you see the housing project they get into, that there's all these connections across the pond, as they say. They differed somewhat from later on from the communists in that they never supported Stalin.
Did they support ultimately the government control of private industry?
They became very strong New Deal supporters, and they definitely pushed for a lot of the New Deal programs. And so yes, for some industries they supported government control, certainly, which we sort of have, the public transportation system, they supported that. And for utilities, they supported government control.
Was their union radical compared to other unions at the time?
Well, I guess it depends on the union. In the early 20s, in 1919, there had been a major strike throughout the country, and some of them were very radical. But that was considered the first Red Scare that came, and a lot of people were deported, and so it really kind of crushed a lot of the union movement. So there were people who were more radical at that time, but in the 20s it was pretty much a low point for labor. So they were unusual in that they were actually growing and organizing and building a movement, and it was more than just a union movement. It was a social movement. You know, they were calling for equality of the races, for women's equality. They were, calling for voting rights in the South. They were pushing for anti-lynching laws. You know, it was actually a
Is that something you think the rank and file factory workers were in on, or they just joined the union and the leaders?
No, they were in. Well, of course, not all of them. You know, I don't like to. Part of my background is in anthropology, so I don't like to make generalizations too much. But a lot of them were. They had something, part of their union that was very democratic. They had a referendum vote. So any major decisions within the union had to be sent out to all the different locals and the rank and file and discussed within the locals, and they would vote on it, and then they would send it back to headquarters before it could be put in, like that thing of sending $1,000 to the Friends of, so that had to be voted on by everybody in the union. So yeah, they did have a lot of, I think that in and of itself gave people in the union a sense of ownership of the organization.
Was there the process of organizing, was it as strife-filled as with some other industries, with steel or coal?
Yes.
It was?
Yes. The textile manufacturers were really blatantly anti-union. And it's something that when I started doing my research and I found a lot of this, I really didn't know what I was looking for, because I had done an oral history of these two people. And I know enough that, oral history, problems of memory and things. So I knew I had to do a lot of archival research. But I didn't really know what I was looking for. So it was kind of coming together from what I found. I didn't go in with a theory. I kind of developed that as I found this. And one of the things that I did find was that there was lots of this in which Howard Kreckman had told me about in 1930, Carl Mackley Memorial at McPherson Square. He was 22 years old, and in the Averly Hosiery Mill, they had brought in, they were trying to unionize, and they had a lockout. They had locked out the union workers and brought in these other people. And a lot of them in this period and in the 20s, they're hired guns. They really, we're talking about, the Jazz Age, and you have a lot of organized crime, and a lot of them were doing this kind of stuff.
These are the strikebreakers you're talking about?
Yes, yes, and they were armed. I never found any evidence that the actual strikers or hosiery workers in Philadelphia had any weapons. It's not to say they didn't fight back, but they did. But these people, they were in a car. They were following some of the strikebreakers to see where they came from, because they weren't from Kensington. They were brought in, and they opened fire on the car, and he was killed, and a number were wounded, and that was their first martyr. It continues.
I think you have in your book a picture from his funeral.
Yes.
It was a big event.
Yeah, it was on all the front pages of the newspapers, which is another reason I don't understand why it wasn't written about, because it was all over the place. It was on the front pages of the newspapers, and it was a lot of this. Even Fortune magazine was written in. It was about 35,000 community residents and workers showed up at this, and they take this pledge, that they will lay down their own lives if necessary to give rights to working people. It was really pretty amazing.
What are Carl Mackley houses?
That is a project that as I said, the union was involved in a lot of social causes. So that was the first housing project under the Works Project administration of the New Deal, that the union partnered with the Works Project, and they built this first project of workers' housing in Juniata, and it's built in the social modernist tradition. The architects themselves had studied over in Vienna and various places when the Bauhaus School and the I think of the other one. But anyway, and so it was actually very advanced. They had this idea that working people should be able to live as well as anyone else. And so it opened with a fully funded and fully staffed nursery school for the children of working mothers. This is 1935. It had a full-size swimming pool. It had a wading pool for children, and they used these ideas of even like passive solar energy, where they had large windows. None of them, the buildings, there's 4 buildings, and they're 3 stories high, so that you don't have these giant high-rises, and they all get sun, and they have green spaces. It was really, it actually has a plaque on it now from the American Institute of Architects. It's considered really.
There was a big strike in 1921, was it? The
one that brought the union back together in 21, 22. Yes, they had split earlier on, then they came back together. Yes, that was the one for control of the industry in 21, 22. Some of the people were out almost a year.
Is that the one where these women? Oh, you have a 1931 open shop strike with
yes.
With some women in jail behind bars,
Yes.
and they seem to be having a pretty good time there.
They were very defiant. That was the whole thing. They practiced a lot of Gandhi tactics. They were being taught Gandhi tactics, and so one of the things was passive resistance, filling the jails. And so a lot of these women are out there on the picket lines, and they're dressed in their, modern garb, and they're being brought into the jails, and they're in jail, and they get released, and they go right back out on the picket line. It just really was kind of amazing. But there was a woman who was killed in 1931 open shop strike as well.
I want to ask you about that word modern, because you refer to modern women, and you said that before. What made modern at the time? What did that mean in the 20s? Well,
the modern women, first of all, they considered that they could do everything that men did. You have women flying airplanes, and you have a lot of women in sports and the movies, and a lot of it had to do with the way they dressed too. This whole new way of dressing that with the shorter, looser dresses, and cut their hair so that they don't have the cumbersome long hair that they used to, and they are partying quite a bit, and there's a much more open attitude towards sex, and there's a lot of this in the magazines and the movies, and that was modern.
I want to ask you about the cover of your book, because it looks like it could be drawn today.
It's Art Deco, actually. It's an Art Deco representation that they used. In many of the iconology you see from a lot of the unions, like steel and all these masculine things, are all these muscular males. Women became very important in the union, and a lot of this, I think, came about because, and women started pushing for more rights within the union as well. But in the 20s and the early 30s, they're portraying them as heroes. The women were the leaders of the strike, and they're out there marching through rain and snow and hail. It was really amazing. So they come up with this picture here, and what she's doing is she's holding Union hosiery in her upstretched arms. Like I said, it's Art Deco. You can see with the angular figures and all this. And with the rising sun of labor over the cityscape in the background. And she becomes the image that they put on their flyers.
Could women have leadership roles in the union?
In the early period of the union was what we call an industrial organization from the beginning, which became big with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which meant that everyone who worked in the industry could be part of the union. It wasn't just a skilled workers union. But women did not have the same vote in the early. They did not have an equal vote. They didn't get that until 29, and that was through a lot of the fact that they were fighting for this, and they started demanding these things. So by 1927, there was a woman on the Philadelphia Executive Board, but not on the National Executive Board. So there's through them fighting they were actually out there really on the picket lines fighting, going to jail, and a woman was killed, and one of them by strikebreakers, and they start demanding more rights. And they're bringing up these resolutions. They start women's meetings, which are sort of like the predecessor to the consciousness-raising meetings of second-wave feminism. And they're coming up with all these things that they're pushing for within the union, including childcare union events, and pay equity, and more leadership skills.
Could you explain the difference between the AFL and the CIO before they united? Yes,
the AFL was basically a union that organized skilled workers. They didn't organize people that didn't do skilled jobs, and so they were really a lot more narrow. The CIO, which was the Congress of Industrial Organizations, was John L. Lewis and all these people came up with this idea that if you're going to have a strong union, you have to organize everybody that's working, which kind of goes back to, as I was saying, the Knights of Labor. They did that, and they were doing that in the 1880s. They were organizing virtually what they said, all who work, and that included, which was unusual for the time, but a lot of African Americans and African American women, and so the Hosiery Union was an industrial organization from the beginning because they come out of the Knights of Labor, but the AFL generally just organized skilled workers. Okay, and so when they found that was the big split between the AFL and the CIO, that you organize everybody.
I want to ask you about a couple of people in your book. Anna Geisinger.
Mm-hmm.
Who was she?
She was a topper in a hosiery plant.
What did that mean?
That was one of the jobs where women held that they transfer the material from the legging machine to the footing machine and add the two together, put them together. And she became very important. She was the first female organizer that they hired in 1928 out of the shops, pulled out of the shops. That's one thing too, all the leadership, everything. People were pulled out of the shops for that. And
so union was then her full-time job?
When she became an organizer, she became a full-time organizer for a while instead of that. And and she became a very popular organizer. She was very good. She became, that she was very good at speaking. I believe she also became a socialist at that time and joined the Socialist Party.
Any of them run for office?
In the city? Yes. Yes, they did. In 1928 and in 1932 they were running. They didn't win any office. In one they were kind of kicked off the ballot on some kind of...
Did they run as socialists?
Yes, they did. Was
the city government with the unions or
No.
with the companies?
Not back then. No, they were. A lot of them were pretty much in the pocket of the companies. So you had the labor police that would actually escort some of these armed strikebreakers into the mills, and that's how some of the confrontations certainly happened in 1933. That happened, and 2 people were killed in one of those strikes.
And you're also right about an Emil Reeve.
Emil Reeve.
Reeve, and he was a rival of Anna Geisinger?
No, not originally. No, He became elected president of the National Union in 1929. Okay, and at first they were doing fine, but he kind of moved a little bit away from. He was getting more into standard politics, and moved away from some of the programs that some of the other people were pushing that were more aimed at the broader community. He was kind of getting into the business unionism kind of thing of just looking out for the union, and a number of people within the hosiery workers disagreed with that, including Anna Geisinger. So, and also, he didn't support women's rights as much as some of the others did. So they definitely started clashing.
He ended up firing Anna Geisinger?
As an organizer, because, well, he tried to assign her somewhere, and she refused to go, which you don't really do. So I mean, it's trying to figure, kind of debatable about that. But Branch One, which was having some problems with Reevy's faction too, which Branch One is the Philadelphia local, and they hired her. So it was kind of a direct slap in the face at Reevy, but at the same time, Branch One at that time was the most important branch, so they couldn't really just kick the branch out. So they did manage to overcome their differences long enough to actually win some important struggles and to move on in support of New Deal legislation.
Another woman you write about is Cornelia Pinchot.
Yes.
Who was she?
She was the wife of the governor, Gifford Pinchot. She was sort of in the vein of Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was very supportive of labor rights and as you know, civil rights. And she was very close with the union. She actually appeared on some of their picket lines, and she came to the Philadelphia office and spoke to the women. And I think these kinds of things also helped move some of the women further towards feminism, like labor feminism, as I see it, because they were getting a lot of these other ideas as well. She was interesting. Howard Breckman talked about it, and Alice, and said, well, she wasn't a very good dresser, she didn't have a very good sense of fashion, but she was right out there with us on the picket line.
What was it like spending time with the Kreckmans?
Oh, it was fascinating, really. They were fascinating people. I heard lots of stories, and part of this for me was fun, especially learning all the stuff with the Jazz Age and finding all these kinds of things. That was fun. Part of it was very inspiring for me, and then there were parts that were troubling, the people getting killed and fighting and all. But Alice would tell me, oh yeah, we women, I belonged to this group we called ourselves the Bachelor Girls, and we went out dancing and partying, she said, and out with the boys. She said, oh, we had fun. But then at the same time, it would turn around and it's like, yeah, we women were out on the picket lines a lot. We would fight, but we were union, So, I mean, that kind of really fascinated me too, this juxtaposition, because these are not, people that are originally, a lot of them, these young people, some kind of ideologues or something. They're just regular people from the community. And yet they move into this whole thing of determine that these are rights, and as citizens we have rights, and one of those is the right to unionize and the right to be treated fairly, and we will fight to maintain those rights. So it's really kind of interesting. Did
the economic health of the industry rise and fall based on the economy or on fashion?
Well, I guess it was a little bit of both. I mean, certainly later fashion changes, but in this period, it was the economy. Certainly, the crash of '29 hit a lot of the industry itself, and overproduction. There was too much out there. So the manufacturers, looking at their side of it, were trying to maintain their profits. And so the way that they were doing that was to try to go after labor and, put in like double shifts and longer hours and pay cuts, which they take. They actually take pay cuts in a couple of their contracts. And some of them are pretty severe because their idea is that we want to keep the union manufacturers alive while we go out and organize the non-union manufacturers, or the ones that are really undercutting everybody else and destroying the industry.
You say in the book that World War I was good for the industry?
No, it wasn't good for anybody, I don't think. But no, not World War I that I know of. I mean, not for this industry. Some people, definitely World War I, as in World War II, because people were away at war, other jobs opened up. So women could go out and get jobs that they couldn't at other times.
I did find this in your book where you wrote World War I, full employment brought about by mobilization of the economy for World War I brought many gains for American workers in the form of higher wages and greater unionization.
During the war.
But it also brought a dramatic expansion in the repression machinery of the state. Using the Espionage and Sedition Acts, the Bureau of Investigation infiltrated spies into factories and collaborated with private labor police, and U.S. military intelligence ignored the Constitution and spied on civilians.
Yes. And that I found, I went to the National Archives and actually looked at the military intelligence files. And yes, they were. Howard had told me that there were spies in the industry, and another scholar had mentioned that I should look at these files, and I did find that there were 6 private detective agencies working in Kensington, as well as military intelligence. And they were infiltrating and spying on workers and, of like people who were trying to unionize and trying to get into union meetings to see what they were doing. And
why military intelligence?
I have no idea. I wondered that myself. I don't know.
And was it because of the international socialism aspect of it?
I don't think so, because they were, this isn't the only industry that they were looking at. When you go and look at those files, I found some where Leopold Stokowski, the leader of the Philadelphia Orchestra, the very famous, they were spying on him. In this period, I actually found some of this because what he did during the Depression, there, a lot of unemployed musicians, and he said he was going to lead a benefit concert for them, and the city told him he couldn't do it. And he said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And he did. So they said that he had left-wing leanings or something. I don't know. So they were spying on him. It was kind of interesting.
When was the industry at its peak?
The peak probably was 28, 29, the actual real peak. But then there was still a lot going on in the 30s. And the problem is it starts moving out to other areas, which is what made it really difficult for the union. They had, weak labor movement. They were trying to organize in all these other areas as well, and particularly the South. And the South was brutal. So they...
Brutal in what way?
The manufacturers were brutal. I think we, in the strike of 1934, when that was the Great Textile Strike, it was called, that they called in. It was a really big strike. About 400,000 people went out all over the country. And people were beaten and shot and bayoneted. I couldn't believe the stuff I found. And in particular in the South, because a lot of the manufacturers who had been the old planters really had control of a lot of the cities and the police and the National Guard.
Tell me about the Apex.
The Apex was the largest shop in the city of Philadelphia. I guess they had about 3,000 workers, and they were extremely anti-union. They used the same attorney that Hitler's government used. They definitely had ties across the Atlantic to the rising fascists in Germany. They recruited workers from Germany, and they were a real thorn in the side of the union, that they kept trying to unionize. So, and they really did have ties to the fascist government. That wasn't just left-wing propaganda. When you do the research, you find it.
Was pay or conditions worse in, say, in the Apex when it was not unionized versus the mills that were unionized?
They people had to dress in a particular way. They were very regimented. They couldn't get bathroom breaks a lot of times. If they did, they would spy on them in the bathroom and pushing them out. And they were definitely lower paid as well. So that was something they were constantly trying to get.
They eventually unionized the Apex?
Yeah, they with the sit-down strikes that were saying. But the Apex, as I say, it was. I do agree. It wasn't actually a sit-down originally. It was sort of a takeover. They kind of attacked the mill and took it over and threw the owner out and took over the mill and demanded a union. That went to court. That did, and they, in fact, brought charges against the union under the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was actually turned out to be a benefit for the labor movement, because the union won that in 1940 Supreme Court decision that a strike was not a violation of interstate labor. It was for unionization, and so they won that. But they lost the other part because there were some damages done within there. And there's a lot of people in the union. People overreact. There was so much going on. So some of the machinery was destroyed, which the company accused them of. I mean, that was, and Howard Kreckman said that. He was really angry. He called them Luddites. These Luddites in the union. so they had to pay a large fine.
Your book covers from the Jazz Age to the New Deal. What changed when the New Deal came along?
Well, it started, I guess, in 1933 with the NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, that Roosevelt puts in. Section 7A gives unions a very small window for saying that people have the right to unionize, but it didn't have anything to back it up. So a lot of the manufacturers would just ignore it anyway. But when that happened, the hosiery workers lead the first strike in the nation, in all sections of the country that make hosiery, and including in Reading, PA, which was a really, had some very anti-union people in Reading. And they really set a precedent for the sit-down. They're doing all this nonviolent Gandhi resistance. So what they did, what they call pulling a Gandhi, where they would just stop work and stand at their machines, motionless. And so they actually do win, because the election, they started under Section 7A, you could have union elections. Before that, they didn't have any right for anything like that. And they win the elections, but the manufacturers pretty much ignore it.
Well, under FDR and the New Deal, was the federal government more favorably inclined to unions? Was there a shift there?
After as a few years go on, certainly, like I said, he passes Section 7A of the NIRA, and that was overturned by the Supreme Court. But then you get the Wagner Act of 1935 that gets passed, and that actually gives people the right to unionize, sets up a labor board, and puts in penalties for if they win the election. If the companies don't go along with it, they are penalized. So that's much stronger.
Why did the industry decline?
Well, there were a few reasons. One was there were changes in technology and machinery. And during World War II, silk wasn't available, for one thing. And they start using things like nylon and all, which stretches to fit the legs, so you don't need the skill to make these. And they have new machinery. It cuts out some jobs. But also, a lot of them are moving to non-union areas. They're moving south because it's very difficult to unionize in the South, and we still have that. But they tried, but all these things together kind of hit the decline of the union.
When did the last of the mills pull up stakes?
In Philly,
Yeah.
I believe it was the Apex. It was 1954, I believe.
Is there any evidence today that it was there?
Oh yeah, there are mills, abandoned mills, and some all over the place in Philly in that section. You can see them, ones that haven't burned down or whatever. Some have been refurbished in the area of Fishtown, which is now gentrifying, and the Brown Hill and Kramer has been turned into luxury apartments, and so the evidence is there, and all the mill buildings, but it's kind of sad because the jobs aren't there. Yeah.
If you go to Kensington now, what do you see?
It depends on where you go. There's the part that's gentrifying, as I said, where property values are going through the roof, and new people are coming in, and then there's the part that is still really devastated by decline from lack of jobs and drugs, But I mean, all these things I think are exaggerations, because even in those areas, there are a lot of just regular people trying to live their lives and trying to get by, but you look at the media and it's crime and blight and drugs, and that just doesn't describe all the people.
Is this your first book?
Yes, it is.
How was it? What's the experience like?
It was mixed. It was a lot of hard work. I had to, the union's files are out in Wisconsin, so I made 2 trips out there, and then there were some in Detroit at the Reuther Archives, and I had to make a trip there, and then there was all the things at the University of Pennsylvania. That wasn't so bad in Temple University. But it was extremely interesting, and finding all this out as being from the neighborhood myself, it was, for me, it as I say, it kind of gave me back part of my heritage too, of knowing all these things that I just had no idea of, because people in Kensington, I know when I was growing up, kind of portrayed as kind of backwards and not very progressive, and so you see that you wonder how all this got, and I know that wasn't true either, even when I was living there, because there was a lot of things going on that weren't.
How long did it take you to write?
The actual book, probably about 5 or 6 years, but it was longer than that because I went back to school later in life, and I used this as my thesis to get my PhD, but then after that to turn it into a book took a lot more research and writing, and so I was working on it for a while, and I had other things going on because I also had children I was raising and working, and but Howard and Alice were constantly sitting on my shoulders, so I know I had to get it done sometime or another.
You think you'll do another book?
Possibly. It's possible.
Well, we are out of time. We've been speaking with Sharon McConnell-Sidorick. She's the author of this book, Silk Stockings and Socialism, Philadelphia's Radical Hosiery Workers from the Jazz Age to the New Deal. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. We'd like to hear from you. Our email address is pabooks@pcntv.com. Like us on Facebook to learn more about PA Books.